Well, welcome. I am Karen Gill. I'm Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and it's an absolute pleasure for me to welcome you to this special forum. We are thrilled to have with us tonight Bill Kristol and Mark Shields, our newest Frey Distinguished Visiting Professors in the College of Arts and Sciences. This is the 17th year that we've been able to provide these events, all made possible by David Frey, a Carolina alum and a longtime supporter of the College of Arts and Sciences. David Frey chairs the Edward J. and Frances Frey Foundation, which made a major gift to the College of Arts and Sciences to support this program. We're grateful to David and his family foundation for allowing us to bring these distinguished guests to Carolina. The Frey Foundation Distinguished Visiting Professorships is one of the highest honors awarded by the College of Arts and Sciences. It enables us to distinguish public leaders in government, journalism, public affairs, international relations, and the performing arts. Over the years, it's enabled us to invite extraordinary individuals to our campus for classes and for public discussions like this. Recent recipients have included David Brooks, E.J. Dionne, James Hansen, Ted Turner, and E.L. Doctorow. This year, we wanted to award this high honor to two individuals who could shed light on the national political scene just 1 month before midterm elections. Tonight, we are very pleased to have Bill Kristol and Mark Shields, two of the most experienced and respected political analysts in Washington today. We are pleased to honor them and grateful to them for coming with us tonight. We're eager to hear from them, and before we get started, I want to also recognize and honor Hodding Carter, who will serve as the moderator tonight. Professor Carter is the University Professor of Public Policy and Leadership here at Carolina. He's an esteemed colleague in the College of Arts and Sciences. Before joining our faculty in 2006, he had a long and distinguished career in journalism and public affairs. He began as a reporter with his family's newspaper, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Delta Democratic Times in Greenville, Mississippi. He then served for 4 years as State Department spokesperson for President Jimmy Carter, including the difficult time of the hostage crisis. Hodding Carter went on to become a nationally known television commentator. He won 4 Emmy Awards and the prestigious Edward R. Murrow Award for documentaries. He also served as chief correspondent for PBS Frontline. He has served as the president and chief executive officer for the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. As you can tell from his distinguished career, Professor Carter is interested in getting us as close as possible to the truth, so he's an ideal moderator for tonight's discussion. I'll ask him to start things off by introducing our honored guests, who will then offer their brief introductory comments, followed by questions from Professor Carter, and eventually we'll invite all of you to participate in asking questions. Please join me in giving Bill Kristol, Mark Shields, and Hodding Carter a warm Carolina welcome.
Welcome to UNC's State of the Union midterm 2010. Actually, welcome to 2 states of mind about the Union. We have no shrinking violets with us tonight, 2 men who have been happy warriors in the partisan conflicts and policy debates of this country for decades. They are commentators and columnists, true enough, but they are first and foremost men of strong convictions enlisted in the muck and mire of politics and governance. In short, they are political journalists with the gloves off and the mask taken off. You do not have to guess about where they stand or from where they are coming. Interestingly enough, that was the way American journalism played out for most of its history, deviating into the more moderate nonpartisanship, or at least less subjective public positioning that followed the years following World War II. Now, mind you, if Barry Goldwater had had his way, neither one of them would have been here tonight, since he suggested the nation would be well served by carving off the eastern seaboard. That having failed, they are both here tonight. And while you have short bios about both of them, I'm going to go on just a little bit longer about both. Mark Shields, on the immediate left of me, your right, has worked in more campaigns than he can remember, and for more major Democratic Party figures than I have time to list. Suffice it to say that the list included Robert Kennedy, Edmund Muskie, Sarge Shriver, and Mo Udall. And for the students who are here, I will ask you who all four were later. He is a native of Norfolk County, Massachusetts, but also gave the nation Abigail Adams, Kurt Schilling, Amy Lowell, and Hal Holbrook. Another test will be for the older folks here as to who those may be. He is a graduate of Notre Dame and the United States Marine Corps, about both of which he is inordinately proud, and from both of which he drew life lessons. And then moved out of that from what was, after all, immediately all politics, into journalism in 1979, writing editorials and then columns for the Washington Post, and then becoming a syndicated columnist for Creators Syndicate. He has been the Democratic spokesman on Friday's sparring matches on PBS NewsHour since 1988 against the likes of David Brooks, William Safire, Paul Gigot, and David Gergen. There is much more that could be said, but let me conclude by noting that he hit one all-time low professionally when he teamed up with me on a PBS show about Congress. Let me simply say it was about as bad a show as you could want, and he had nothing to do with how bad it was. He went immediately into his longtime gig with PBS. I went immediately into academia and the foundation world. That said, I have to go forward with our next speaker, who is Bill Kristol, a trifle younger than Mark Shields, 15 years younger, who has carved out an impressive career as the most visible leader of American neoconservatism. In one sense, he came by it naturally. He is the son of Irving Kristol, the intellectual architect of the movement. And another, I have to note that he did it by the hardest, having received both his BA and PhD from Harvard in the 1970s, not precisely an incubator for the left. There is little he has not done to advance the conservative, neoconservative cause. He held significant posts in the Reagan and first Bush administrations. He was a point man strategist in the successful rejection of the Clinton health care plan in 1993, and was, among other things, foreign policy advisor to the McCain presidential campaign in 2008. But his enduring contribution has been his leadership in founding the news magazine, The Weekly Standard, in 1994, whose financial underwriter is Rupert Murdoch, but whose contributors are legion in the conservative ranks. He is a regular commentator on Fox News and has worked for brief periods as a columnist for Time magazine and the New York Times. Most recently, he was an ardent, public, and consistent advocate of the war in Iraq, in good times and bad, and of Sarah Palin, of whose vice presidential nomination it can be safely said he was the alpha and the omega. She has, however, and it should be said, taken care of herself ever since. These have been long introductions, but these are substantial players in the public life of the nation. Each, by the way, has taught at universities and colleges in the past and will be presenting a class to a small group of students tomorrow morning, which they have volunteered to do. Each will now give brief opening remarks. We're going to talk among ourselves for a while thereafter, and then we'll go to you in the audience for question and answer, and there will be microphones. There are microphones set up at each aisle as I see it. We will go in the order they determined, and thus Bill Kristol goes first.
Well, thanks, Hodding, for that very nice introduction. It's great to be here with my friend Mark Shields. It's great to be here at UNC and Chapel Hill. I feel I have a connection with UNC since our oldest daughter went to Duke. I would like to say Mark's daughter went to Duke too, so we're equally blameworthy. But I found it's generally, I've been at Chapel Hill a few times, I've been in North Carolina several times since Rebecca, she's since graduated, went to Duke, and I've always thought, when she first went there, I thought, well, this will give me a real connection with the hometown folks in North Carolina, and I found out that not everyone, much to my surprise, in North Carolina loves Duke University. It is good to be here, though, because high regard for UNC, for Chapel Hill, for North Carolina. I think it's an interesting state, actually, very swing state politically, which is nice and balanced, somewhat different from what I'm used to, having grown up on the Upper West Side of New York. Bella Abzug was my congresswoman as a kid. That's why one reason I became a conservative. I then went to Harvard. That accentuated the process, and ended up I'm actually teaching a class, as Hodding said, with Mark tomorrow morning here, and then I'm actually catching a plane to Boston and guest co-teaching a class at Harvard tomorrow afternoon. It's always great to get up to Cambridge. It's a little different from North Carolina, which, as I say, is kind of balanced politically. You have a Republican senator, Democratic senator, close races in many of the congressional districts. Cambridge, Massachusetts is a little different. I once taught, actually, at Harvard for a couple of years at the Kennedy School of Government there from 1983 to 1985. I was the token conservative on the faculty there. They like to have one at all times. It's useful for the students to know what one looks like, especially when they get out of school and have to have a job interview or something. In any case, just to give you a sense of politics in Cambridge, Mass, in 1984, we lived in Belmont, just outside Cambridge. It was the 8th congressional district of Massachusetts. Tip O'Neill was our congressman. He was Speaker of the House. He was a revered figure in the Boston area, totally Democratic congressional district. It had been John Kennedy's congressional district, actually, 30 years before. And to give you a sense of the politics, I remember voting in November '84, and I voted for Reagan for re-election to the presidency, and I voted for the Republican Senate candidate running against John Kerry. It was Kerry's first Senate race, actually. I'll interrupt the story to say that I mentioned this. I ran into John Kerry a few years ago. He was doing Fox News Sunday, I think, and we were chatting in the green room, and he vaguely remembered I had some Harvard connection, and he said, didn't you go there and teach there or something? And I said, yes, I taught at the Kennedy School. And actually, I voted in '84, in your first Senate race, I voted against you, Senator Kerry. And maybe you're not aware of this, but John Kerry doesn't have a great sense of humor. You know, so he looked down and I said, well, I mean, nothing personal. You know, he won by 10 points or something. I said, I'm conservative, I voted for the Republican. And he looked at me and said, Bill, you know, my opponent was not well qualified for the job. Lighten up, Senator Kerry. Anyway, and in the congressional level, I, as a dutiful Republican, Reaganite, voted against Tip O'Neill, even though his election was, of course, a foregone conclusion. And I remember the next morning, this is before the internet, of course, and so you had to look at the papers to see what had happened in the races that weren't, covered on TV. And I knew Reagan had won, and I knew Kerry had won, and I was curious how many votes the Republican running against Tip O'Neill had gotten. And I was looking at the paper at breakfast, and I asked Susan, just out of curiosity, how many votes did the Republican running against Tip O'Neill get? And Susan looked at the Boston Globe and kind of looked again and said, I hate to tell you this, there was no Republican running against Tip O'Neill. And I said, I know I voted for someone. It turned out I voted for the communist. This is a true story. It almost stopped me from getting a job in the Reagan administration, but they gave me a waiver, and I came to Washington and have lived in Virginia, which is more like North Carolina, ever since. I'll be very brief, since I think I've taken up my time already, but it's a very interesting moment politically, and I think I'll just say two things. One, it's very interesting because it's so volatile and fluid and unpredictable a moment. From about 95 to 2005, American politics, there's a lot of surface turmoil, a lot of interesting turmoil. Impeachment of the president, Bush-Gore, the decision to go to the war, 9/11, obviously, the decision to go to war in Iraq. But politically, things changed very little. Pretty evenly balanced parties. Republicans had a slight edge. They tended to hold the Congress. But the national elections were very close, of course, Bush-Gore being the closest, and pretty, 50-50. And what happened, and it was unexpected. After 2004, Republicans had won, Bush had won the re-election. Republicans had held Congress. Karl Rove thought there would be a new Republican majority. Things went very bad in 05-06, and the Democrats broke out. Big victory in 06, and then followed, and this is unusual in American history, by another big victory in 08, where they increased their numbers in the House and the Senate, increased their majorities. President Obama won the biggest majority since Lyndon Johnson for a Democratic president. And it looked like the dawning of a new liberal era. May still turn out to have been, but that's certainly going to be interrupted by this November's election, which is going to be a pretty big Republican landslide, I think. I think Republicans will most likely win the House and have a shot at making the Senate close to 50-50. So it'll be a pretty big reversal of 06 and 08. It'll be one of the first times in modern American history that there have been 3 elections in a row when there have been major changes in the electorate's judgment of which party they want to be put in charge. It will have followed, obviously, major policy changes, health care, the stimulus, and the debate over that, the debate over things like cap and trade, financial regulation. I mean, this has been a lot of policy issues on the table, a great divergence of views among the public. I'd say conservatives are re-energized and are thinking about things that were not on the table 5 or 6, 7 years ago when George Bush really, domestic policy was pretty centrist on most things and didn't try to cut spending much. His biggest legislative achievement was probably the expansion of Medicare, actually. And Democrats had gone to the center under Clinton. The variability of possible outcomes now over the next several years is much greater than it has been for the preceding 10, 15 years. And that's the big fact, I think, about American politics. I'm happy as a conservative and as a Republican that I think this November will be a good showing, and I think it'll be good, from my point of view, for the country to check President Obama on domestic policy and maybe support him on the things he should be supported on in foreign policy and encourage him to be even a little stronger. But in terms of what's happening in the country, it would be foolish to project out and say that Obama's finished or liberalism finished. It would be foolish, just as it was foolish to say 2 years ago that the Republicans or conservatism was finished. The Tea Parties, the Obama activism in 08, the Tea Party activism in 09 and 010 shows great energy on both sides of the aisle and makes it a very fluid, unpredictable moment. I think it's a good moment to be interested in politics. It's an interesting moment. It's a good moment to be engaged in politics because people really can make a difference. A lot of Obama supporters felt that in 2007, 2008. They did make a difference. A lot of conservatives feel that, and independents, for that matter, feel that in 09 and this year, and I think they will make a difference. But I'll just close with this one historical analogy maybe to help you think about it. I mean, we got a little used to, I would say, from the late 80s, really all the way to 2005, to a reasonably stable situation in American politics. There weren't many dramatic policy changes, really, for many of those years. There were a lot of partisan fights, but if you step back and came down from Mars and looked at the situation, it didn't change that much. As I say, the electoral balance was fairly steady. And we kind of forgot what it's like to have really volatile politics. And if you want an example of that, go back to, say, 1964 to 1980, when Mark got involved in politics, when Hodding was in government. He remembers what it was like. I mean, think of it. In 64, Goldwater defeats the establishment of the Republican Party and begins to change the character of that party. He gets clobbered by Johnson in the general election. Great Society happens, huge policy changes, some good, some maybe not so good. 66 is a rough election for the Democrats. By 68, Johnson, who had won the biggest majority in American history, modern American history, in 64, is denied the nomination of his own party by Gene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy in a primary challenge. Nixon comes back. Wallace runs as a third-party candidate. Nixon barely gets elected in 68 after he'd been consigned to the political graveyard a few years before. Then in 72, the McGovernites take over. Well, take over is not fair. They win the primaries and George McGovern wins the nomination and starts to dominate the Democratic Party. Nixon clobbers McGovern, but then the Watergate happens and the Republicans get slaughtered in 74. In 76, Ronald Reagan challenges a sitting Republican president, almost beats him. In the Democratic primary, an unknown, Jimmy Carter, a one-term governor of Georgia, beats a whole bunch of very well-known Democratic senators, former vice president, people who'd been on the national stage. Carter has a rough presidency, and in 1980, Reagan changes the character of the Republican Party, I would say, completes the kind of Goldwater conservative reshaping of the Republican Party. Carter is challenged by Kennedy in a primary, beats him back, but then loses the general to Reagan, and Republicans take the Senate for the first time in a quarter century. I mean, that's a pretty volatile 15 years. And that's what I think is the model for what we are now a bit of the way into, but only a bit of the way into it. So it's very hard to predict. It's very fluid. It's exciting. I think it's good for the country on the whole, because it's a democracy and people have strong views, and in a way it's healthy is when the big institutions begin to break apart a little, and a lot of grassroots movements, left and right, center, can make a difference, and I think that's really what's happening now and what will happen over the next few years.
Thank you very much, Hodding, for that wonderful introduction. It was far superior to the introduction I received recently in Baltimore, where the Master of Ceremonies said simply, "Now for the latest dope from Washington." And I appreciate your kindness and your generosity. In a spirit of full disclosure, I admit I stole that line from Senator Alan Simpson, the retired Republican Senate whip from Wyoming, a man of enormous humor and considerable bile. Once, when asked his church preference, Alan Simpson dared to answer red brick. But I'm delighted to be here in Chapel Hill. And to be with Bill Kristol and Hodding Carter and with you. Bill's mention of his voting pattern in 1984, which I'm sure he had to confess to the Reagan White House, but he reminded me of Ronald Reagan's campaign in 1980, which I was lucky enough to cover. I disagree with Ronald Reagan on 7 out of 8 issues. It never bothered him. He carried 44 states one time, 49 the next. But he was fun to cover. He was an engaging man, comfortable with himself, and he used to say things that weren't true. I mean, there was no attempt to deceive, because deception was not in the man's soul. But along the way, it had been a long way, he picked things up. They got on the 5x8 cards. Sometimes they didn't have a strong empirical basis to them. And we, on the press bus, used to call them factoids. They weren't fact, they weren't fiction, they were factoids. I mean, one of the Gipper's favorite factoids in 1980 was there are 212 taxes on a loaf of bread. There are not 212 taxes on a loaf of bread. Asked about this by a young AP reporter who kind of asked him, "Governor, could you give us your source for that?" The Gipper, with that 10,000-watt grin of his, said, "Reader's Digest, April 1946. Right next to Humor in Uniform, I think is where it was. We're in Steubenville, Ohio, in September 1980 is the day Ronald Reagan delivered what remains my all-time favorite factoid. Trees cause more pollution than automobiles. We all headed for the phones because we knew this was as good as it was going to get. It's an amazing concept. I mean, the next time you're in the New Jersey Turnpike and your eyes are watering from the diesel in front of you, blame a pine tree in Maine. Well, as luck would have it, it wasn't terribly good for the Republican ticket that day. Our next stop was in Southern California. It was the worst air pollution inversion week it had in the Los Angeles basin in 16 months. We went out to Claremont College, where Governor Reagan was speaking, and some wise guy graduate student hung a sign on a tree that said, "Cut me down before I kill again." It's one of the reasons I like politics. It's a lot of fun. I think it's also nothing less than the peaceable resolution of conflict among legitimate competing interests. And I don't know in a nation as big and brawling and diverse as ours how else we'd do it, except through the political process and those who share their time, their talent, their skill to fashion compromises, to craft consensus. I pray that we never do it just on sheer numbers or muscle or money alone. I believe in the political process. I like particularly people who run for office. Most of us in life go to great lengths to avoid rejection of any kind. People who put their name on a ballot risk rejection, where everybody they ever sat next to in their study hall, double dated with, or babysat for, knows whether they won or more likely they lost. And if you and I are the final two competitors to be the Great Lakes coat hanger general sales manager, and you get the job and I don't, when the hometown paper announces your promotion, they don't say Shields was passed over because of lingering questions about his expense account or his bizarre behavior at the company Christmas party. But there's a way. In politics, it's there for everybody, again, that you know or even don't know, or just know your name. to see that public rejection. I've always admired candidates who could win and lose with humor and grace. My entire experience, nobody ever did that better than a fellow named Dick Tuck, who lost a state Senate primary in Los Angeles. When the reporter from KMPC radio put the microphone in his face, said, "How do you feel, Mr. Tuck?" He said, "The people have spoken, the bastards." We're in a remarkable political time. This is Tip O'Neill, whom Bill mentioned, had a favorite aphorism, and that is, all politics is local. Faithful attendance at wakes, weddings, bar mitzvahs, and junior high graduation translates into votes. It's true, all politics is local, except when it isn't. And we are in the prospect of, right now, on the cusp of 3 successive nationalized elections. Nationalized. And they aren't elections of great ideological dimension or definition. They have been 3 elections in which the ins have been thrown out. For the Democrats' sake, in the first 2 cases, the ins were Republicans. Now, the roles are reversed. The tables are turned, and the Democrats are the ins. The best description, I think, of our politics from 2006 forward is that we've had 3, or about to have 3 successive Mae West elections. For those of you in the room too young to remember Mae West, she was the original blonde bombshell in Hollywood, a lady of profane utterances and very earthy manner. And she had a favorite line, I think, that describes our politics since 2006, and that is, when forced to choose between 2 evils, I always like to pick the one I haven't tried before. And that's truly, I think, where we are. American voters are not like academics. They don't grade on the curve. They grade on how their life is going, and very pragmatically. We've had 2 presidents in the past 60 years who have served 2 terms and then left office at 65% approval ratings from their fellow citizens. They couldn't have been more different. Bill Clinton, a Democratic governor from Arkansas, and Ronald Reagan, the leader of the conservative movement, Republican governor of California. Ronald Reagan came to office, said, "I'm going to balance the budget, cut taxes by 1/3, and double the defense budget." 2 out of 3 ain't bad. But he did, in fact, cut taxes by 1/3 at a time of double-digit inflation, double-digit interest rates, and double-digit unemployment. And 4 years later, when he ran for re-election, 3 out of 4 voters said they were better off than they had been 4 years before, and Ronald Reagan won re-election. Bill Clinton came to office at a time of then record budget deficits. And he set about balancing the budget, an issue put on the national agenda by the third-party candidacy of Ross Perot, and neither party was able to duck it. And as part of his difficult budget balancing program, it involved raising taxes on the wealthiest of Americans. Clinton passed it without a single Republican vote in either the House or the Senate. He paid dearly, his party did, just as Reagan's did in 1982, for his strong medicine in midterm elections. Bill Clinton's party paid even more dearly in 1994. But by 1996, when Bill Clinton ran for re-election, 3 out of 4 voters said they were better off than they had been 4 years earlier. I would submit to you that in 2010, the Democratic congressional candidates are going to bear the burden of the bad news. By 2012, in all likelihood, the situation and the conditions of the country will have improved. Voters will be more optimistic and upbeat, and they will be no longer required to grade on the curve, that in fact, things will be better. And President Obama's re-election is not by no means a lead pipe cinch, but I think any premature obituaries on his political career are just that. American voters, in the final analysis, I think are best described as being philosophically conservative but operationally liberal. And by that, what do you mean by that? It means you ask American voters in the abstract, what about the federal government? It's a pain in the neck, too much red tape, get them off my back, out of my pocket. You'd say, wow, those are pretty ardently conservative folks. However, those very same Americans, when told that just outside of Pocatello, Idaho, a single can of tuna fish has been discovered with a trace of botulism in it, have a universal American reaction. Where the hell was the federal government? I want a report of my office in 24 hours. I want heads to roll. I want accountability leveled. We all want this efficient, effective, small federal government working on our side 24 hours a day cheap. And that's why the American political body asks the same question over and over. Is it working? Does it work? Has it worked? And they made that judgment. You can question it, but they made it in both Clinton's case in 1996 and Reagan's case in 1984. So I think that's what we're looking for is a year which is going to be awfully kind to the Republicans, but it by no means guarantees an outcome in 2012. There are only three things the Democrats have to do in order to turn it around in 2010. Unfortunately, nobody knows what they are. Thank you.
You've spared me having to ask the question which everybody came here for you to answer, which is how will the election come out a month from now? I think you have both agreed that this is going to be something ranging from disaster to horrible decimation for the Democrats, or have you agreed on that?
I think right now I'd say that, and remembering my precinct committee woman's admonition from more than half a century ago, a week is a lifetime in politics and a month is an eternity. But I would have to say right now that the Republicans will win somewhere north of 30 seats in the House of Representatives, maybe 35, perhaps even all the way up to 50. In a strange way, the worst outcome for the administration, for the Obama administration, would be if the Republicans got 215 House seats and the Democrats had 220. Because that would mean the Democrats then have nominal control with absolutely no power and no ability to pass anything, including a Mother's Day resolution. So if you're talking about President Obama running for re-election in a Democratic administration, it's probably in its interest not to have 215 Republicans in the House, if you're going to have that many, and you probably are, but rather to have 230. And because then the Republicans can no longer simply be the party of no. They have a responsibility as to run one of the branches of government.
And you hadn't spoken of the House, and you are inclined to believe they're going to take the House. And the Senate is...
I mean, I think it's hard to say, and
say it anyway.
We have a month, no, but we have a month of campaigns, and the voters like to make up their minds, and we'll be surprised in some races both ways. You know, people in Washington tend to slightly overgeneralize, especially on Senate races, where these are big, high-profile races. There'll be debates that many viewers will watch. Someone will do worse than expected. Someone else will do better than expected, and there'll be some surprises. But I would say, if just looking at the numbers, here in '94, starting from almost the exact same number of House seats, the Republicans won the national vote by 6.7%. If you add up all the congressional races in '94, they won the national margin was 6.7% of the popular vote, and they won 52 seats. I think personally, right now, looking at the numbers, the Republicans are likely to exceed 6.7 by a little bit, 7, 8, 9% maybe on the national ballot, which would be a big reversal. The Democrats in 2008 won the national congressional vote by 10 plus points. So that would be a pretty huge switch. On the other hand, it's exactly the switch that happened in Massachusetts with Scott Brown in 2010. It's what happened in my state of Virginia and New Jersey in 2009. Obama carried all those, and they all swung by about 15 to 20 points. So I think you're going to get a big swing, and I think Republicans win the House pretty easily. I'd say there are 4 or 5 chances of them winning the House, and pretty good chance of winning it by a big margin. Senate, most likely outcome I think is probably Republicans pick up 7 or 8 seats, but I don't think it's out of the question that they get to 10 and take control. Most Republicans I know hope they don't take control of the Senate for kind of the reason Mark said. If you're in control of both branches, you suddenly have great expectations. In a way, if you control the House, well, you can stop some stuff that President Obama wants, but no one expects you to really radically change the course of the country. But I think it's going to be very interesting if Republicans control one or both branches. They have run on bold platforms. The Tea Parties have, of course, really ginned up the anti-big government concern, as well as the facts, the huge deficit and debt and the big spending programs of the president. And it will be interesting to see if Republicans are cautious or bold and how they work. On the one hand, people get nervous with big change, as we've seen with President Obama. On the other hand, people want big change. A lot of conservatives do. And it's going to be a very delicate task for the Republican leadership to figure out how to handle that situation.
Two questions. First, for years, way before Bill Clinton, a guy named David Lawrence, who owned and edited U.S. News and World Report every 4 years, would write, "It's always the economy." And it would drive people crazy like me who knew it was about morality and issues and all the rest. Bill Clinton says it's the economy stupid. I was listening to your list of victories, and one of the things that they all shared was the economy was moving right along. Is it the economy all the time, or is it an overrated factor when it comes to these elections?
Well, I don't think there's any question the economy is the dominant issue in this election. When you've got 70% of Americans who know somebody close to them who's been laid off, it has sapped what is probably, I think, the most distinguishing of all American characteristics psychologically as a nation, and that is an almost incurable and invincible optimism that has been the hallmark of this nation. We are now a nation of pessimists and increasing pessimism, and I have to feel that the economy contributes to that. But right now, 2 out of 3 Americans believe their children's lives will not be as full as their own have been, according to the Wall Street Journal NBC poll.
Yeah, I'm slightly against the excessive economic determinism, as maybe you are too, in this way. I mean, look, in '94, which as Mark mentioned, the Democrats lost control of both houses of Congress for the first time in 40 years. The economy was improving. Unemployment dropped by a percentage point in '94 from, I think, 6.4 to 5.4%. I think we had 3.5 to 4% GDP growth. It was coming back, and it began coming back from the 91-92 recession, actually in the last quarter of the Bush presidency, not that it did him any good. And then 93 was a little slow, 94 picked up a little. And for whatever reason, fair or unfair, voters had decided they didn't like Bill Clinton and a Democratic Congress. There was some overdue realignment in the South with a lot of older Democratic congressmen who had held on to seats for a while. And for various reasons, people were willing to make a pretty big turn against the Democrats, and I think they just preferred balanced government. In 1982, the off-year election of the first Reagan term, unemployment was 10.8%. Interest rates hadn't come down that much. It was objectively pretty rough. 81, there was a little recovery, and then sort of like now, actually, there was a little recovery in the president's first year, and then it sunk back down in the second year. But Reagan lost 26 seats in the House, half of which were probably due to reapportionment. He lost no Senate seats. He did pretty well, given the objective factors. Why? Because conservatives and Republicans had a line. Again, agree or disagree, they had a rationale. The Reagan tax cuts didn't take effect until January 1st, 83. And Republicans were able to say, look, Volcker is squeezing inflation out of the economy. This will take a while. It's rough. We've got to stay the course. Those tax cuts are going to kick in. The pro-growth agenda, stay the course. It'll work out. And as Mark said, the economy was roaring by 84, and Reagan got reelected. I think that's the problem Democrats have this time. What's the argument, really? I mean, they've done the stimulus. They did it in the first week. They promoted quite vigorously that it was going to have an effect in the first year, or at least this year. And so why should we think things are getting better if you're an independent swing voter, if you stick with this sort of Obama-Pelosi agenda? I think that's hurting candidates on the trail. They don't sort of have a good story to tell in a certain way, except the Republicans are even worse, and Bush got us into this ditch, and it's taking a little longer to get out of it than we hoped, which, again, may or may not be a fair thing to say, but it's not a very inspiring thing to say to your own voters. I do think Mark's scenario of Obama coming back in 2012 is totally possible, but remember, with Clinton, the economy really did come back in 95 and 96. And what you have to ask is, objectively, will Obama be able to run as a peace and prosperity re-election candidate, which is how Reagan ran in 84 and is how Clinton ran in 96, or not? And I hope as an American that the country is peaceful and prosperous, but objectively, I think the odds of that are lower than they were in the case of Reagan and Clinton.
We have a lot of things to talk about, but I don't want to get off of this for one reason. What is a steady line is a line down of American faith in virtually all institutions, and it's been going on through my adult lifetime. I mean, literally, through my adult lifetime. It reflects itself in various ways, and then it has eruptions. And right now, I mean, what the Tea Party people are saying, among other things, is this is not only broken, it is utterly corrupt, and we have to absolutely undo all the bit of it. You guys live in Washington and play within the Washington confines. Do you think that's a fair analysis of Washington, that it is corrupt, broken, dysfunctional, and needs to essentially be taken with a long ledger and wiped off?
I'd like to answer that with an anecdote, that personal anecdote. In 1965, I went to work in the United States Senate for Senator William Proxmire, Democrat of Wisconsin, and I was legislative assistant working on civil rights. And the big item was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which passed the public accommodations law the previous year, which entitled African Americans to go to theaters and movies and restaurants. But voting rights was actually going to change political power in the South. And there was a real filibuster led by Democratic senators from the South, and it went for 9 weeks. And every day, the 4 sponsors of the Voting Rights Act, Senator Mike Mansfield of Montana, the Democratic Majority Leader, Senator Everett Dirksen of Illinois, the Republican leader, Senator Phil Hart of Michigan, the Democratic senator sponsor, and Senator Jacob Javits of New York, the Republican, would meet to plan strategy. And at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they'd meet with the press and brief the press. And Everett Dirksen, being a Shakespearean fellow, sort of dominated them with his colorful language and his inspired metaphors. Mansfield was rather a reticent, almost self-effacing majority leader. After a few weeks of this, the chief of staff, another Democratic senator, was sent to talk to Mansfield's chief of staff and to complain about the fact that every day these 4 senators met outside of Dirksen, the Republican leader's office. And the complaint, which was felt by other Democratic senators, look, couldn't we at least meet a couple of days a week out at Mansfield's office so people would see this is a Democratic bill sponsored by a Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson. And Mike Mansfield, Montana, a product of the hardscrabble mines of Montana, later teacher of Asian history and the professor of Asian history at the University of Montana, with a withering look, turned down his own chief of staff and said the following. He said, last year, in 1964, under Barry Goldwater, the Republican Party suffered a historic defeat, in large part because they left and violated the tradition of Abraham Lincoln on civil rights. Anything that helps the American people see the Republican Party returning to the mainstream and to its original roots of Lincolnian rights is good for the Republican Party, and it's good for the American political process. Now, the idea today of any leader, and these are people whom I like in many instances, but whether it's Harry Reid or Mitch McConnell or John Boehner or Nancy Pelosi saying something like that in the current polarized, you call it corrupt,
I said people call it corrupt.
People call it corrupt. Washington is unthinkable. So it has changed. It is a changed place. And I'm not as sanguine as Bill is about the Tea Party, because having covered the Tea Party races, they view any sense, this is the overwhelming majority, view any sense of collegiality or cooperation as collusion with the enemy. They don't want cooperation. They don't want comity. And we're going to face a moment in early 2011 when the debt ceiling of the country statutorily has to be raised. And John Boehner, what everyone thinks about him, is a grown-up. He's a mature legislator. He's been a legislator. And he understands that you can't close it down. But I can tell you right now that there's going to be a strong impetus to close everything down. And there are going to be enough Republicans intimidated and terrified by what happened to Bob Bennett in Utah and Lisa Murkowski in Alaska and Mike Castle in Delaware to hear the thunder of hoofbeats and be convinced that the Tea Party is the wave of the future. So I am not optimistic about that development, and I am concerned about Washington.
You do not, I take it, see it quite that way.
No, not quite. I mean, I'd say two points. It's obviously a big question, but I mean, there is more polarization today than there was 40 years ago when this happened. No one designed that. No one sat and said, let's have a polarized system. The Democrats became an overwhelmingly center-left party. The Republicans became an overwhelmingly center-right party. Liberal Republicans from the Northeast gradually disappeared. Southern conservative Democrats from the South gradually disappeared. And you just have two parties that disagree more about more issues than was the case 30 years ago. Now, once upon a time, that was thought to be a good thing. The American Political Science Association had a famous report, I think it was in 1950, we need towards a more responsible two-party system. And it was a big thing when even as late as when I was coming to college and grad school, lamenting the fact that our parties were so heterogeneous and they were all so confusing and you couldn't have the voters didn't get a real choice, Well, now you do have two distinct parties. There's therefore less compromise. Having said that, when the financial system really looked like it was going off the rocks, TARP was passed by a Republican president and a Democratic Congress with bipartisan votes, not without some uproar and difficulty, but at the end of the day, we were able to do what people at the time thought at least was the right thing. And I would point to foreign policy. I went through this, I was a big supporter of the war in Iraq, and 07-08 was a bitterly polarized fight over Iraq, as there had been about Vietnam. The truth is, in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, whatever you think of the policies, there have been very few partisan fights on foreign policy in Congress. Republicans have supported the president on Afghanistan, and believe me, there's a lot of temptation among Republicans, and we'll see if the leadership can resist this next year, to say, hey, this is his war, and it's a mess, and he's probably not doing a very good job at it, and that deadline is stupid in July 2011, so let's just turn our backs. But they have resisted that. There's really been very little in the way of cheap shots, I would say, by Republican legislators or candidates. If you watch Linda McMahon debate Richard Blumenthal, which I happened to do on Monday night in Connecticut, she's kind of a Tea Party type, and she was supportive of the president on Afghanistan, on Iraq, on defense spending. Actually, for a very polarized situation on core foreign policy issues, I think there's a little more consensus than there was when you were at the State Department and when there really were huge fights on foreign policy between the Republicans and Democrats. I am also, on the whole, generally a defender of these populist eruptions in the sense that I think they are healthy reminders often to out-of-touch elites, whether it's the Perot. I wouldn't have voted for Ross Perot for president, but the Perot voters did force Republicans and Clinton to take the deficit seriously. Obviously, in the 60s, there were important social movements, civil rights being the most important, that forced the elites to come to grips with injustices in the country. And I think the Tea Parties, I mean, some of the particulars are off, and some of the candidates they support wouldn't be my first choice necessarily, but I think it's a healthy reaction to a fact, which is that we have an unsustainable debt and deficit. We can quibble whether it's Bush or Obama who's responsible. The Tea Parties actually are not that partisan. They were happy to blame Bush as well as Obama. But you can't go on with $1.3 trillion deficits, and that has to be resolved. And either we have to cut government or raise taxes, and that'll be a big debate over the next few years. But I think I give the Tea Parties credit for saying you just can't sustain this.
Point of disagreement. The Tea Party is not Perot. The Tea Party is the Barry Goldwater movement within the Republican Party. The Tea Party is a Republican. It's a conservative Republican takeover of the Republican Party. Tea Party voters are not independent voters. They are Republicans. They are angry Republicans, and they do. Bill's right. They do acknowledge the role that a Republican Congress, that 6 years of Republican domination of the Congress and the executive under George Bush, the first 6 years of this century, did, in fact, lead to dramatically increased spending and an increase in the debt. You recall, when George Bush became president, the prediction by every economist, including the OMB, including Alan Greenspan, was a $5.6 trillion surplus. And that was the reason we could have and had to have these tax cuts. Otherwise, the surplus would be cascading revenues and would threaten the stock market, was the argument. It really was a different time. I would agree, Bill, that they did finally were forced to act on TARP, on the Troubled Asset Reform Relief Program. But I'd also point out that Eric Cantor and John Boehner and Mitch McConnell, all of whom voted for it, now spend all their time attacking it. They denied paternity, even though they were involved, and Boehner played quite a statesman-like role at the time, going to the floor and urging Republicans who had deserted their president to back it.
Well, look, I'm sitting out here, and the one thing I know for a fact and certainty is that one thing about the Tea Party resonates with me, and that is some people I don't really know seem to have extraordinary influence. Let's talk about money a while. Let's talk about big, big money. And I'm not making this Democrat or Republican, since that's a game that they all know how to play. What is this group supposed to think about their participation in a system which at the end of the day comes down, in which the mother's milk, as usual, is money? But in this case, it's one hell of a big cow.
Well, I mean, I think it's out of control. I think it has been out of control. But I think now, thanks to the Roberts Court and its decision that the money of corporate treasuries and labor union treasuries, which are not nearly as copious or as abundant, can be tapped unlimited for political contributions and campaigns, and as well preserving the anonymity of contributors. We've reached a point now where money doesn't talk. I mean, money yells. It absolutely dominates the discussion. One of the reasons I'm not sanguine about, or cheerful or optimistic about the last 4 weeks is I have been told by Republicans that there will be $60 million advantage over the last month in these anonymous PAC giving and expenditures on behalf of Republican candidates. Well, that does have an effect. And the reason the anonymity matters is that it's accountability. I mean, if I accuse Hodding Carter of being a practicing agnostic and, you know, his sister was a thespian, whatever else, you know.
Well, in both cases, I'm an Episcopalian.
He's Episcopalian because they're better dressers.
Right.
But it comes back to me. I mean, I have to defend it. But when it's a hit and run in the middle of the night and the drop is made that, you know, whatever allegation or smear you want to make about somebody, and there it is on television with no attribution other than something sweet like Citizens for a Better America.
I got to let you in here because we've got a whole bunch of territory. So I know you are not as.
Well, I'm good. No, we have very stupid campaign finance laws which limit donations to $2,400. And in fact, in Virginia, where I live, in the gubernatorial race, there are unlimited donations. They're fully disclosed. People write checks for $10,000 or $50,000. Both parties raise a lot of money. We've had Democratic governors and Republican governors in Virginia. We've had Democratic-controlled state legislature and Republican-controlled state legislature. The reason the money goes into these anonymous places is because wealthy people and certainly corporations and labor and other institutions are going to want to affect the political process. But, you know, the Democrats spent $400 million more than Republicans in 2008. Republicans may outspend the Democrats a little bit this time. But Barack Obama was not selected by a bunch of rich people to beat Hillary Clinton. She had most of the big shots in the Democratic Party locked up. McCain was outraised considerably by Romney and Giuliani in 2007. So I'm not happy about some of the big money stuff, and I think Tea Party people are right to think that, you know, there's a little bit too much incestuousness at the Treasury and the Fed and the New York banks, and I'm sort of a populist on that stuff, and I think conservatives need to be pro-market and not pro-big business. Having said all that, if you just look at the last couple of races, Obama and McCain is not what big money wanted, you know, and the outcome, I suppose, Obama beating McCain was not particularly what big money wanted. So I think it's overstated, the notion that, you know, they're pulling all the strings and people can't have an effect. And in these primaries, it wasn't what big money wanted, you know, Joe Miller beating Murkowski in Alaska. So we'll see what happens in some of these races.
Let me shift totally before we do go with the audience up. We have now been, in the way some people measure things, in the longest war in American history. I don't actually measure it that way, but it doesn't matter. We have been engaged in that section of the world a very long time. The rationale shifted in Iraq, obviously, but nonetheless, we have been staying a very long course. In Afghanistan, the
rationale may not have shifted privately, but publicly, going after al-Qaeda no longer seems to be the objective, which is what we went after before. We were there in the business of nation building and gutting the Taliban, all of which may be very well. Tell me, how long will this take? I ask you now as an advocate and a very persuasive one. How much longer does this go on?
I don't know. I mean, Iraq was unpredictably bad for the first wave and then sort of got unpredictably better in 2007 and 2008. If you predicted almost no U.S. combat, very, very few U.S. combat deaths in 2009 and 2010, in the middle of 2006 or 2007, people would have thought you were crazy. I don't think we can afford to have Afghanistan be ruled by the Taliban and therefore be a place, a safe haven for al-Qaeda. So I think we have to stick it out. I think it's more doable than people think. That's something we'll see over the next year. I would give General Petraeus a chance. I would urge people to give President Obama and General Petraeus a chance and support them in what they think, and I tend to think, and both parties have thought, is an important national interest. So I don't think it's the right way to think about it. I mean, obviously people always want a war to end, and they want foreign involvements to end. I'm not sure the world in the 21st century gives us the option of saying, well, we're in this for 3 years, but sorry, at that point our patience is exhausted. I don't think our enemy's patience is exhausted.
And Mark?
I think of the 8 dozen lessons of Vietnam, there was none more important than that an army doesn't fight a war, a country fights a war. And if a country isn't willing to fight a war, it should never send an army. And this is not simply the longest by calendar. This is a war the only war in American history that would fought, A, without a draft, and B, with tax cuts. All the suffering, all the sacrifice, all the fighting, and all the dying has been done by less than 1% of Americans and their families. It is before we went to war in Iraq, and the Congress voted on it, 535 members of Congress, myself, one assistant, called every office, and we asked a question. Do you have a child in the enlisted ranks or a relative in the enlisted ranks of the United States military? Out of 535 members of Congress, exactly one of them, Senator Tim Johnson of South Dakota, had a son, Brooks Johnson, who was a sergeant, 101st Airborne. This is such polar opposite to the American experience of war demanding equality of sacrifice. When I grew up, President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt's 4 sons all served in combat positions. I grew up in Massachusetts. We had 2 Republican United States senators. Leverett Saltonstall's 19-year-old son, Peter, was killed in the Pacific as a Marine. And Henry Cabot Lodge, the other Republican senator, actually resigned from the Senate to become a tank commander fighting Hitler's armies in North Africa. When you separate those in power from those at risk, as we have done in this country, under both Republican and Democratic presidencies, something goes out of it. Bob Gates was right when he said the war has become an intrusion, an interruption, an intervention, an inconvenience. People go out of their way to praise the troops, and every politician can be counted upon to put in a nickel and he'll give you the speech about how wonderful and admiring he is. I don't know how many they've entertained in their home. I don't know how many they want as their next-door neighbor. But there is something missing when we fight a war in the abstract. Bill's own son is serving, and I salute him and commend him. But it is rare, and it is wrong. An army doesn't fight a war, a country fights a war, and we have yet to have a president in this time ask young people at Chapel Hill or Notre Dame or Duke or Harvard to join the military. They'll make wonderful sort of abstract statements about service and service to your fellow men, but asking them to join the military and to put their lives at risk for their country because the mission matters. That's the only reason we had protests to Vietnam, is that there was a draft. It was as long as they were just drafting kids from small towns and from central cities, it was an inconvenience and a problem. But once they started reaching McLean, Virginia, and Bethesda, Maryland, and Shaker Heights, Ohio, and the better suburbs, then it became a great moral issue. And that's when the campuses were roiling. And Richard Nixon, whatever he was not a dumb man, and he knew what he was doing when he abolished the draft. And when he did, he just deflated the anti-war movement and took the energy out of it.
Which means that the liberal Democrats who supported it were dumb, right?
Yep.
Now, because we really do want to go to you, and because I can't really see you, and if the lights would come up a little, it would help. Those who want to ask questions, please come to the microphone, and I will recognize you alternatively as we go. Sir.
The question for Mr. Kristol.
You might as well go ahead and tell us who you are.
I'm Richard Laxer. I'm a citizen. You mentioned there's no plan to polarize the country, but it has occurred to me that the current wave of hyperpartisanship is really the direct result of the perfection of the art of wedge politics by Lee Atwater with Karl Rove at his knee. Do you agree?
I mean, both parties have used wedge issues, and one person's wedge issue is another person's legitimate issue at times. So I wouldn't. I think both parties are pretty guilty of some pretty bad appeals over the last 25 years, and I'm not sure one is more guilty than the other. But no, I don't fundamentally agree with this. I just think what's happened is, and this is a bigger sociological and cultural fact, the country has become more polarized. It's sorted itself out more sociologically and economically. What Mark refers to as one little part of that, I would say, in terms of the military. And, you know, no one planned this, but you just have a party. It's just a fact. That more, now, if you're a conservative, you're a Republican. If you're a liberal, you're a Democrat. It wasn't pretty much, and vice versa to a surprising degree. And we have some somewhat accidental things, gerrymandering of districts, for example, which has been bipartisan, obviously, which has, in fact, increased the polarization in the House because there are more people from safe seats. Now, we'll see what happens after this election. You know, an awful lot of Republicans are going to get elected in swing districts, and districts that obviously have had Democratic congressmen in the last term or two. Everyone can say, well, these are Tea Party people, and they're a bunch of, you know, wackos who are just capitalizing on discontent with Obama. If they want to stay in office, we know that, as a fact, that their voters, a majority of people in their district, have just voted for Democrats. So I think they're going to have interesting, you know, choices to make in terms of some of their policy positions. But no, I think it has been more polarization, but I don't really think it can be put at the feet of any one or two political strategies.
I'm Ray Falk, citizen, Chapel Hill. I'm concerned, when Ronald Reagan cut taxes in 1980, the immediate effect was that the interest on that year's deficit went up to parity with the entire deficit from the year before. And the interest is an obligatory government expense. Even the military is not strictly obligatory. And I'd like to address the tax issue from that point of view.
Well, you're right. I mean, that was Perot's message in 1992. I mean, I sort of stood in awe of Perot in many respects. I was maybe the last member of the press corps who defended him. And even after he said that the Republicans were going to sabotage his daughter's wedding, which was about as loony as you could get. I've been around politics for a long time, and I've heard people say all the mischievous things they want to do to their opponents, like let's order 400 pizzas COD to our opponent's headquarters. Let's call forward our opponent's switchboard to a 900 number in New Jersey. But I've never heard anybody, even after a six-pack of Smirnoff, say, let's sabotage our opponent's daughter's wedding. But Perot made a wonderful argument in 1992, and it was directly consequent from the 12 years of Republican stewardship in which the national debt then quadrupled from $1 trillion to less than $1 trillion to $4 trillion. He said, every dollar and dime of income tax paid by every American living west of the Mississippi wasn't enough to cover the interest on the national debt. It didn't put a plane in the air, didn't put a book in a child's hands, didn't fill a prescription or build a bridge or a road. And boy, it was just amazing to watch audiences acknowledge that. I mean, every waitress and school teacher, nurse and small business person, that's what it was going for. Now, we've been spared that now because of the Federal Reserve, and we've got no interest loans on money. that's going to come home to roost. And that interest on the national debt is, whoever's there in the next 6, 8 years, 4 years, is going to climb dramatically to the point where it is the second biggest item in the national budget. And it's, it's a real problem because nobody sees anything from it, and it basically represents a transfer payment from those on ordinary income to the people who own bonds. And the people who own bonds, according to the Federal Reserve economists whom I've spoken to, 91% of them come from the highest income groups. It's nice to say, oh boy, they're owned collectively by teachers and folks like that. No, but the people, the individuals who own bonds. So I think you're onto something, and it's a fuse that's already been set, and it's going to come back and explode.
But forgive me, that means the Tea Party is right.
The Tea Party is right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Tea Party is right. I mean, the Tea Party is right about the deficit, no question, all right? And that it is being passed on to our kids and grandchildren and everything else. But I mean, we've had a balanced budget in the past 50 years under one president, Bill Clinton. And if you want to go back, and all you have to do is look at the figures, and they're very straightforward. What percentage of the gross domestic national product we spend in outlay and how much we collect in revenues. And under Clinton, where we had 3 successive balanced budgets, you collected 19.5% at the minimum in gross domestic product in revenues, in taxes, all right? And you spent less than that. We are now spending 24% for a whole host of reasons. I mean, part TARP and stimulus and a whole bunch of other things, the loss of revenue. And we're collecting 14%. Well, there's no way, that you're ever going to balance that. I mean, there's no way you're ever going to bring it to balance. I don't care how much cutting you do. I don't care how much trimming back you do. I mean, you've got to figure out some balance between these two. And that involves tax increases, and it involves tax increases across the board. Probably involves tax reform and losing some benefits that we call tax expenditures or deductions or whatever. And it's going to require some cutbacks in expenditure.
You know what? I know you want to come in on that, but I also worry about people, if you don't mind. Go ahead.
Well, thank you both for coming tonight. Just as a little bit of background, in 1980, I was a member of the Fourth Estate, the press, and had the privilege of covering campaign visits in Tennessee by former Presidents Carter, Reagan, and the first George Bush. With that said, I have 2 questions, and both of you are welcome to answer them. The first one is, did Velma Hart's candid statement that she was exhausted, did that have any effect on President Obama? Is he now listening to the American people? And the second question is, given the expected outcome of an overwhelming Republican victory, how is President Obama going to react to his best friend and severest critic, Rupert Murdoch? Thank you.
Oh, it's all yours.
I don't speak for Rupert Murdoch, or I don't know what his relationship is with President Obama. They know each other particularly well. Look, I think one of the big interesting questions, obviously, is how the president reacts, assuming there is a big Republican victory a month from now. Most of my conservative friends think he's a very ideological liberal. He's not like Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter, for that matter, won their nomination running against the left wing of the Democratic Party. They had ability, and their innate tendency almost was to go to the center. And for Clinton, it was almost a reversion to what he had done in Arkansas in '95 when he went to the center. Barack Obama doesn't have that history. I mean, he just never has had to. He's never particularly taken on the left wing of the Democratic Party, or let's say the orthodoxy of the Democratic Party or the liberal establishment on any issue, the way Clinton did on welfare, for example. So a lot of my friends think Obama stays the course. He bets on his stimulus and his other policies. He bets Obamacare gets more popular. He tries to make the Republicans look like extremists, and he just sticks the way he is. I'm a little less certain of that. I just think politicians are he's a smart guy. Politicians are pretty pragmatic. I think the departure of Larry Summers and Rahm Emanuel may mean something. They're not particularly left, I wouldn't say. They may have even been a little more centrist than some of his other advisors. But what they both are is very sure of themselves. And I think a lot of President Obama's problems have something to do not so much with the ideology, that's a problem from my point of view too, but just the kind of cocksureness of their policies, the unwillingness to say, hey, maybe we got something a little wrong and let's adjust a little bit here. And I think with the new Chief of Staff, if he becomes permanent Chief of Staff, Pete Rouse, who's more of a traditional Hill guy, kind of a conciliator, a compromiser, I'm not sure that President Obama couldn't shift pretty effectively, honestly, a little more than my friends hope and expect, my friends who think he's going to, as Mark said, be unlikely to be reelected in 2012. I'm really agnostic on the 2012 issue, and I think one way for him to do it is on the deficit. I mean, what if President Obama says, you know what, I thought I had to do the stimulus, which he had to get off the mat and get the economy going. It's a slow growth economy, but it's growing. But here is a serious budget cutting proposal on February 1st when they introduced the new budget, with real cuts, not just slowing the rate of growth, real cuts in some domestic programs, including ones that liberals like me tend to like. And I dare you Republicans to go along with this. And I mean, it could be effective politically, and I don't rule that out.
It's a psychological thing that you raised in a recent column, though, Mark. No joy.
No,
joy
it is. I would, quickly on your first question, it was rather a remarkable moment when a woman who was a card-carrying supporter of the president said, "I'm tired of defending you." I mean, that's the one you're referring to. And that was, I thought it was a rather dramatic moment. I think it's great for a president to hear that. I mean, as Bill knows, even better than I, but I know from having been around them for a long time, very few people rise in Washington by delivering bad news to the president or anybody else. I mean, everybody, there's good news, everybody's lined up to, boss, I want you to know, I had a large part of this. But I think that was good for him. What he will do, I don't know. And I think that's the question. And he stands up on November 3rd, he says, I hear you. I heard you. And then what is the action statement that follows? I'm not sure what it is. It's Hodding's question to me was, it's an administration I find conspicuously free of joy. I made a little fun of Ronald Reagan earlier, but I just point out that in 1984, in January of 1984, the Gallup poll found that optimism in America was at the highest it had been in 25 years, all the way back through Kennedy and Johnson and all the way back to Eisenhower. That's how optimistic people were, even though the economy still hadn't kicked in to the point where it was improving, that inflation and interest rates was still coming down. But that was Reagan. Reagan had an ability to do it. I mean, there's an absence of self-deprecating humor in this administration, and it's reflected in those around him. I mean, there's no. They all look like their puppy just died. I mean, I'm not asking them to be, one-liners or anything of the sort, but there is a psychology of the country. Franklin Roosevelt lifted a country's spirits when 1 out of 4 heads of household was unemployed in the country, and the country had lost 50% of its gross national product in the 4 years prior to his coming to office. I mean, that's the kind. And yet he lifted those spirits. I mean, it was a jauntiness and an optimism and a resilience that was contagious. And I really think this will be a real test of President Obama and whether he can do it for the nation. Because the nation needs it.
One anecdote, just because it illustrates Mark's point. If you haven't been in Washington or in the White House or in the State Department, it's a little hard to understand how can they get in such a bubble. Don't they read the paper, they watch TV? But it is amazing. I mean, when I worked for Vice President Quayle, he actually has a very shrewd political sense, and he saw the recession in '91 and its effect on the country much more shrewdly, frankly, than President Bush and Treasury Secretary Nick Brady. And he was a good Indiana politician. That's a pretty middle-class state. He really had a feel for it. And I remember there was a meeting the president had with a bunch of business leaders, and we scheduled a little meeting privately with some of those business leaders beforehand. This was late '91. And the vice president said to him, look, when you get in the Oval Office, let's just totally off the record, he said, I want you guys to tell the president what it's like out there. And don't sugarcoat it, because he needs to hear this from you. And frankly, he comes to these meetings here, and chief economist, who's a good guy, says, we're going to come out of this, don't worry. And the budget guy says, we're going to come out of this. And I remember this meeting well, and this is very rare for the vice president to sort of coach, some business guys on what they might say to the president. And they all said, yes, sir, this is very important. They were mostly Republicans. We want the president to recover. He's got to understand, though, that he can't just look like he's out of touch with the problems in the country. We then all march into the Roosevelt room to the meeting with the president, and the president greets them all, a little chit-chat. He was sort of very good at this, the first President Bush. And, John, what's it like in here? Mr. President, the people appreciate your strong leadership. I remember looking at the vice president thinking, hey.
Just one quick one on Reagan. I heard during the 80 campaign, one of the wise guy reporters had a glossy photo of Reagan in bedtime with Bonzo, okay? And there he is with a chimpanzee. And he asked Governor Reagan to autograph it. And Ronald Reagan signs it, best wishes, Frank, Ronald Reagan, and puts a print, I'm the one with the wristwatch.
All right, we have time for 2 more questions, maybe. Yes.
Hi, I'm Cindy Bowman. Thank you both for being here. The older I get, the more I find myself in support of term limits. I think that the words career and politician should not be used in the same sentence. But I wonder if that might be simplistic and maybe I'm missing something. So I'd like to hear what your pros and cons are on term limits for senators and congressmen.
I can give you brief answers. I was in favor of term limits when the issue came up in the early mid-90s, and I'm still open-minded on it, and I think certainly a politician might voluntarily choose that, and I think the voters might well reward him if he keeps his promise. That was one reason someone like Senator Bennett lost in Utah, that he had promised that he would limit himself. He didn't, and they thought, oh, it's a guy who just likes having this as a career. But I've got to say, empirically, the federal term limits were thrown out by the Supreme Court. State-imposed term limits on their federal officials were thrown out by the Supreme Court in '95, I think. But some states do have term limits in the state legislatures, and others don't. And political scientists have looked at this pretty closely, and I've looked at it just, anecdotally, and it's not clear that you're better off. California has pretty strict state term limits on state legislators, and that places, a perfect example of bad government now, I think, and interest group dominance and all this. And so I'm not against it, but I'm skeptical that it's as much of a silver bullet as I personally thought it might be 15 years ago.
I covered the debate when the Contract with America came in, and they promised to vote on term limits. And the most effective opponent of them was Henry Hyde, the great conservative Republican from Illinois. And he took to the floor in his lumbering style, and he turned to his Republican side, and all these guys were ready to vote for term limits. And he said, if you get the diagnosis today, and they say, we're going to have to operate, and they've just shaved your head, and they've put the pencil marks they're going to make, I want you to turn to that surgeon and say, I hope you're not a career physician. I want somebody just out of medical school.
Last question.
Hello, I'm Raymond Massabird. I'm a Chapel Hill student. My question concerns the Tea Party. Other than Congressman Paul Ryan, why is the Tea Party / Republican movement not seriously advocating for entitlement reform as a major platform moving forward?
Well, we'll see look, the Tea Party is a very disparate group of individuals and candidates, and a lot of them are talking about entitlement reform. It's not easy to do entitlement reform, and we'll see what they actually propose if they control either House or Congress. We'll also see what Republican governors are doing. But I think it's fair to say Republicans will have to be judged by their actions. And I do think the governors are important. This isn't quite entitlement reform, but it certainly is government reform and spending reform. If Chris Christie has fizzled out in New Jersey, and Mitch Daniels hasn't turned out to be a successful governor of Indiana, and other governors, Republican governors, flop, then I think voters in 2012 will say, well, that was nice talk by these Republicans that they could do a better job than President Obama, but when they were actually given the authority, they didn't. Now, if, conversely, Daniels has cut spending in Indiana and Christie has cut spending in Jersey, and it seems to have worked as a matter of policy, and they've maintained political support, which is a lot of ifs, that would be very impressive, and I think that's why one of those guys could well be the nominee, or Paul Ryan, I think, is a central figure. One of the big moments to watch for next year is President Obama's budget will be about February 1st of 2011. That's when OMB submits the president's budget. If Republicans control the House, they will submit their budget. around April 1st. Paul Ryan will be chairman of the Budget Committee if they're in the majority. That will be a big moment because voters will look up and say, okay, this is the budget, this is reality. How different is it from President Obama's? I mean, President Obama has the deficit of $1.3 trillion for next year, and the great Republican alternative, after all this chest thumping and talking and Tea Party activism, if the Republican alternative is, instead of 1.3, 1.27 trillion deficit, people are going to laugh at it. On the other hand, if they really start to cut and do entitlement reform, there'll be a huge amount of screaming of an obvious sort. So I think it's a delicate choice, politically, frankly, for the Republicans, but I think Paul Ryan becomes a central figure and maybe the most important Republican in Washington over the next year.
There will be a moment even before that, and that'll be when the commission, appointed by the president and chaired by Erskine Bowles, the former chief of staff in North Carolina, and the son of this university, and Alan Simpson, the Republican former senator from Wyoming, have a deficit-cutting commission. It has to report in December. Now, it requires, there's 18 members, requires 14 for any particular recommendation. It'd be interested to see what they do come up with. But your question about the entitlements is perfect because the group that is going to vote in this election, more than any other, are voters over the age of 65. You ask who's most interested and most enthusiastic about this election. Voters under the age of 35, 35% of them are. That's why President Obama is spending his time on campuses and trying to gin up enthusiasm among younger voters. Among voters over the age of 65, 65% of them are. And what's the Republicans' message to them? The Republicans' message to them, and you go state after state, district after district, is President Obama wants to cut $500 billion out of Medicare. So this is a party that's running to win in 2010 on preserving Medicare, which the party really doesn't have a great commitment to philosophically. So it will be interesting to see whether, in fact, the Paul Ryan position does prevail. And it's going to require a little agility politically for them to do it. I'm not saying they can't or won't. But the Democrats' rebuttal will be, if there's going to be cuts in entitlements, whether it's Social Security or Medicare, who do you want making those cuts? Do you want people who believe in the program, who pass the program, who care about the program, or do you want people who have been trying to dismantle it? That will be the political argument. The substance will be an entirely different matter.
All right. You each have learned how to do this, so you've got about 45 seconds each to say something profound. Or you actually just terminated. You got it.
Seems like a sucker argument,
Let me ask.
A sucker request.
It is a sucker request for this reason. We had so much untouched that I thought there might be one thing that you had meant to put out here and haven't. One thing I would say, and I think Mark, I've heard him say something like this too, is for all the troubles and all the partisanship and all the huge debt and difficult wars, I actually am optimistic. I am by nature not such an optimist. I'm not like Ronald Reagan. I'm sort of a pessimistic guy. Cheerful pessimist, I hope, but a pessimist most of the time. But I'm actually pretty optimistic about the country. And I think young people, I'm optimistic about my kids' generation, who I think are more serious, frankly, than we were, and can fix the mess, a lot of the mess that we will end up leaving them. And they made a slight mistake, young people, by voting for President Obama last time. But, the great thing about growing up is they can change their mind. And so the huge preponderance of Democratic and liberal votes among young people is just an invitation for them to get wiser as they get older. Mark, last word.
I would just speak to political courage, which the first time I ever slept in the same quarters with African Americans or took orders from African Americans was at Parris Island, South Carolina, Marine Corps boot camp. And the only reason I did that was because a president of the United States named Harry Truman said it was, in the final analysis, un-American, literally, to ask people to fight and die for their country and then to segregate them by race. And I admired, too, the courage of Ronald Reagan, who, mounting his last chance to become president of the United States, to have any hope, he was going to be 69 years old in 1980, in his home state, or adopted home state of California. That was one of those interminable and innumerable ballot questions that Californians famous for, that make political consultants very wealthy people. And this one would have prohibited any gay or lesbian person from teaching in the public schools of California. It was the Briggs Amendment. Similar measures have been adopted in St. Paul, Minnesota, and Kansas, and Oregon, and as well as in Miami, Florida. And it was leading in the polls. And Reagan came out against it. And he said, this isn't how we judge teachers in California. We judge them whether our children learn in their classroom. And he turned it around, and it went down to defeat. And such proposals were never heard from again. But, you know, politics at its best is the kind of politics that rebuilt a war-devastated Europe through the generosity of the Marshall Plan that took want and terror out of old age through Social Security. And the final analysis, it reminds every one of us that each of us has been warmed by fires we didn't build. Each of us has drunk from wells we didn't dig. And we can do no less for those who come after us, and together we can do much more.
Thank you both, Frey.
Thank you. Good, friend. Yellow. Thank you, kid. Thank you.
I'd like to thank our distinguished guests for their very, very wonderful evening and sharing it with us tonight. There is a reception in Girard Hall next door, open to the public. I hope you will come, have some refreshments, and have a chance to talk to our guests. Thank you again, Hodding Carter, Mark Shields, and Bill Kristol.
Will be on your left.